Stream. So please give me a nod when that's coming through. Excellent.
All good.
Great. So I'll just start off with a little bit more of sort of the personal history. So I suppose you could describe me as a kind of career headhunter, but a headhunter who's worked across, you know, 3 distinct areas. So I started off, as Jerry mentioned, as a specialist, recruiting actuaries predominantly. Not sure how familiar the audience is with actuaries, but they're the individuals who calculate when you're going to die. So they're generally a very cheery bunch. Chief risk officers, chief auditors, and worked predominantly with, you know, large cap insurers, the likes of Aviva and Legal in General, but also with a number of Lloyd's syndicates. I then moved into what's known as recruitment process outsourcing. So if you think about outsourcing in general, you know, a Serco or a Capita, this is the equivalent for recruitment as an activity. So the Adecco Group is the largest recruitment organisation in the world, at a 34,000 person, $7 billion cap business. And my role there was to work with a range of clients, almost all FTSE 100s, but across a range of different industries. So I did work with financial services, but also, you know, telco, automotive, energy, etc. And I'd work with those clients to go in and look at their executive resourcing solutions, which was pretty fascinating, as you can imagine, and produce some common themes around spending more money than they thought. Generally, a lot of the money they were spending wasn't being spent on results, and a complete lack of governance when it came to senior hiring. All of which inspired me to think about moving in-house. So around about 3 years ago, I interviewed with AstraZeneca. I had no experience of pharmaceuticals at all in the past, and I have to say it's an endlessly fascinating industry. And was brought on board initially to lead executive search across their finance function, but now I lead a team of headhunters responsible for pipelining, succession planning, as well as direct search and insights across all of our corporate functions. So that's finance, HR, legal, communications, sustainability, compliance, business development and licensing, as well as IT, procurement. And I also lead a project to look at the challenges of engaging with digital talent, which is something that all organisations, regardless of industry, regardless of size, are coming up against, and it informs a reasonable amount of the following presentation. So to start things off, I wanted to sort of look backwards to look forwards. So I wonder if I give you 30 seconds in the chat, who can name the object that's up on the screen here? So I'll just stay quiet. Well, we know you can, Jerry, and a very humorous response it was too. But I can't actually see the chat because I'm presenting. So if we give it another sort of 10 seconds or so, Jerry, if you could read out a few of the answers. I think we have a pretty educated crowd, so you're on mute there.
Yeah, so Paul Gibson, yarn thing. Kathy was spinning Jenny. Jenny was a spinning Jenny. Yarn,
yeah.
Paul.
Very good. Very good. I'm, impressed as I expected with the knowledge. So, spinning Jenny is a really interesting example of historical technological disruption. So, it was invented in 1764 or 1765, depending on who you read. And in effect, it's an automated labour device. It's automated, the hand spinning of cloth, and actually is quite simple. Some of the outputs from this simple technology are very interesting. So it caused an economic explosion. You can argue that it ignited the Industrial Revolution, and it really created a completely new industry, as well as really creating the urban economy. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Bristol were hamlets when this thing was invented. There were some really significant downsides. The conditions in which people operated these were nothing short of atrocious. It's a little bit later in era terms, but think of the term Dickensian, and it certainly applies. It also destroyed, maybe jobs is the wrong term, certainly income streams in rural areas. So a lot of women in particular in rural areas earned small incremental extra income from doing homespun. That was taken out within 10 or 20 year periods. And it also propped up slavery in the American South. So the demand for cotton that this industry generated was the singular economic model that propped up the slavery economy in the south of the US. Maybe more neutral, positive or negative, depending on your particular outlook. It caused a mass migration from rural to urban. It eventually led to unionized labor. You can certainly argue that it was what was behind the creation of the British Empire. But the bald statistics is the cotton industry employed 1.5 million people by the 1830s. So you effectively have 0 to 1.5 million people in a 70-year period. But I think the key question is, what's the really sort of crucial factor here? Is it actually the technology? Is it the spinning jenny? Or is it the environment into which it was launched? And I've got a quote here from Eric Hobsbawm, who is a favourite historian of mine. So I'll just indulge myself and read through it quickly. So whatever the British advance was due to, it was not scientific and technological superiority. The French produced more original inventions, such as the Jacquard loom, a more complex piece of apparatus than anything devised in Britain. The Germans possessed institutions of technical training, like the Prussian Berg Academy, which had no parallel in Britain. He then goes on to say some extremely rude things about the British education system, including Cambridge. So I didn't put those in the quotes. I didn't think it would be appropriate. But the right conditions were visibly present in Britain. The cotton industry was thus launched like a glider by the pull of colonial trade to which it was attached, a trade which promised not only great but rapid and unpredictable expansion, which encouraged the entrepreneur to adopt the revolutionary techniques required to meet it. So I think before launching into the state of disruption, digital automation now, it's definitely worth thinking back to historical precedents and really thinking about, is it the technical or the cultural and environmental that's really important. So moving to today, I've pulled out a few trends that are pretty clearly going to be emerging in the 2020s. So you can group them into 3 buckets, so technology, data, and geopolitical. On the technology side, most people in the know seem to be predicting that Moore's law is going to break. So Moore's law is an equation that effectively says that computational power doubles every 2 years. With the proliferation of new technology and computing power that's coming through, so clouds, which we're all pretty familiar with, edge, which kind of operates on an instant data way of working. So real-time data is generated by users, and that's what powers the technology. And further ahead, quantum computing, which I'm not even going to pretend to understand, but is clearly on the horizon. So that's one, very key trend for this decade. But also data is distinct from technology. So there's been an absolute crash in the cost of processing data. I mean, in the scientific industry, something like the cost of processing the human genome has gone from millions to thousands to hundreds, and will go to pence and cents in the foreseeable future. And that means for all organizations, the strength of your data, the quality of your data, and your ability to analyze data is completely indivisible from strategy. And what this is creating are customer-centric ecosystems which demand data sharing and really, really high degrees of segmentation as well. And then finally, the geopolitical piece is really fascinating. So there's a recentering of gravity, broadly from west to east. One of the things that's really driving this is the reinvention of finance, the digital payments economy that's really being led by China. And there's a really sort of topical live real world example of that right now. So the IPO of Ant Group, which is the financial services digital payments firm set up by Jack Ma, who was the founder of Alibaba, he made the decision to list this on the Hong Kong and Singapore stock exchanges and not in New York. And for a fintech firm, regardless of the country of origin, that would have been inconceivable, even 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's a really interesting sign of a recentering of gravity in terms of investor power. Maybe a recentering of gravity in terms of innovation, which is probably even more important. But one of the things that's slightly worrying but very interesting is Chinese government have put a halt on the IPO, and the reasons behind that, there's a lot of speculation about what they are. Whether it really is about trying to control an emergent technology or trying to control Jack Ma, but it's a real sign of that tipping and what that could mean in terms of the two different types of ideologies that are driving the global economy. And then the final trend is sustainability, and I think it leads to this question around how do we build an economy through this decade that allows us to achieve growth without, frankly, junking the planet. So that's the kind of macro perspective as I see it. And then just moving into some more specific things to do with organizations before we talk a little bit about sort of skills and capabilities. I'm sure to a lot of you this is a reasonably familiar diagram or shape, whatever you want to call it. So the S-curve depicts incremental, disruptive, and radical innovation. So when a business is launching a new product, it will go through this traditional cycle, and I really like this illustration because it's talking more about the mindset of where people are on that journey than the journey itself, perhaps. But in effect, when you launch a new product, it starts with low growth, and then it develops more rapidly as consumers start to warm up to the products. The business expands, but then eventually, a host of factors, internal, external, etc., start to slow that rate of growth, and then eventually you're into kind of status and potentially decline. So that's a model that's reasonably familiar. Where we are now is we have perpetual and overlapping S-curves. So the cycle of disruption and change is increasing exponentially. I think everyone's familiar with that. The challenges for organizations and for individuals is to respond to those competing agendas and to have, first of all, very clear sight of where you are on that curve. And that's a very difficult thing to do when you're in the middle of it. But also to spot, what's emerging next, and ultimately where to make decisions on where you're going to invest if you're an organization, or if you're an individual, where you're going to position yourself. Where are you going to try and upskill yourself in a certain area? Where are you going to look to move your expertise towards for that new emergent curve? So I think this is something that is only really going to increase over time, and you'll start to see 3, 4, 5, 6 different products or disruptive factors that are impacting on organizations and individuals as that change rate increases. And then I think another real consideration is how organizations respond to technology. So there's a couple of different laws that describe this quite nicely. So the first is Martek's law. So technology changes exponentially, never more so than now, but organizations change logarithmically. So management's job is to choose carefully which changes are going to be adopted. And there's also Amara's law. Amara's law states that over the short term, the impact of disruption, technology change, whatever you want to call it, is overestimated. But in the long term, the impact is underestimated. So I think as business leaders, it is an absolutely key equation to have in mind when making decisions about what to pursue, how quickly to pursue it, when to throw out the old model and embrace the new. But I think it's equally relevant for individuals when thinking about how to position yourself, when thinking about how to develop your career forwards. And a really good live example of this is something called the Gartner hype cycle. So this provides a really nice sort of visual representation of the maturity and adoption of technologies and applications, and their potential relevance to actually solving real problems, as well as exploring, and exploiting new opportunities. So the methodology really allows you to have a kind of overview, but it also allows you to anticipate how technologies and new ways of working are going to evolve over time. And it allows you to think about when you're actually going to deploy, rather than just absolutely being taken in by the next cab off the rank in terms of an innovative product or solution. So just to describe this a little bit more, so the innovation trigger, so this is a potential technology breakthrough, kicks things off. Early proof of concept stories and media interest trigger significant publicity. But there's often no usable product that exists, or if there is, it's commercially not viable or unproven. And that leads through to the peak of inflated expectations. So that early publicity provides a number of small success stories, often accompanied by a number of failures. Some companies take action, many do not. And then next comes the trough of disillusionment. So interest wanes as experiments and implementations fail to deliver. Producers of the technology shake out or fail, something we saw certainly in the dot-com era. Investments continue only if surviving producers improve their products to the satisfaction of those early adopters. And then the slope of enlightenment, which is probably my favorite phrase. More instances of how the technology can benefit the enterprise start to crystallize and become more widely understood. Second and third generation products appear from technology providers. More enterprises fund pilots. Conservative companies still remain cautious. And then becomes the plateau of productivity. Mainstream adoption starts to take off. Criteria for assessing provider viability are more clearly defined. And the technology's broad market applicability and relevance are clearly paying off. So all of these things, allow you to separate hype from reality, can play a big role in sort of assessing risk of investments, and actually really help leaders to understand the technology versus what suppliers, providers, IT leaders might be telling you. And I think there's some really interesting ones on here. So some of the things that I mentioned in the sort of earlier trends piece, so quantum computing is very much in that sort of hype and innovation stage, but something like edge computing is really moving towards that sort of peak of inflated expectations. Some of the things that are in the peak of inflated expectations now are obviously very familiar. They're really buzzwords. So, Internet of Things, connected home, autonomous vehicles, nanotechnology, etc. And then some of the things that are further through at the trough of disillusionment, thinking particularly of augmented reality. I think that's something that was enormously hyped a few years ago. Software-defined security is an interesting one, which is something we're probably pretty aware of every day with some of the data breaches we see in the press. And then some of the things that are starting to move towards viability, in all honesty, things like virtual reality. So, using this to look at what a particular technology and the solution associated with it is really able to achieve can be pretty critical, not just for businesses, but for individuals thinking about their next move and how they upskill themselves. And this kind of nicely leads into what businesses are actually doing now. So this comes from a World Economic Forum report on the future of work from 2018. And you might ask, why would I sort of pick something from 2018 to talk about in 2020? But it's really interesting because it talks to predominantly human resources leaders, but other executives at a whole range of companies. So, Fortune 500, but also startups and SMEs. And it asks them a lot of sentiment and intention questions about what they'll be doing and investing in by 2022. So it's a really interesting report to look at because it looks back a couple of years, but we're right at that midpoint between where they were and where they're projecting to be. So some of the new technologies that they're looking to adopt quite nicely align with that sort of hype curve and some of the earlier trends we looked at. So this is a list, a sort of percentage of those leaders who see investment by 2022 in each of these different elements. So data analytics is one that I think all organizations feel absolutely compelled to invest in. App and web-enabled markets. I think we talked about increasing customer segmentation and demanding customers. I think COVID has really accelerated this. Obviously, the sort of switch to mobile device and online is absolutely critical. But some of the things further down are what you'd expect. So blockchain, which gets a lot of it's often sort of touted as a panacea for any number of problems, but there's still no significant sort of appetite to invest just yet. And quantum computing as well seems to be a bit of a glint in the eye. I think a lot of people are probably like me and don't necessarily understand exactly what it is. And I think really interesting is looking at how these technologies are going to impact on effectively human versus machine working hours. So this is really into the crux of the automation side of the question. So what you've got here from top to bottom is on the left-hand side a list of the activities that are currently most completed by human hours versus machine. And then you've got the 2022 projections of how those are going to change. So I think what this says to me is that in the near term, it is all about augmentation rather than replacement. So this is the prime example of technology freeing up time, releasing hours from repetitive manual tasks, particularly data inputs, and allowing employees, allowing workers to focus on more strategic tasks and ultimately more creative tasks as well. So, in the short to medium term, this is a pretty optimistic picture for me. It's pretty clear that, data processing is an area that's going to continue to move towards machine, and that'll kind of hit the tipping point probably around now. Be interesting when this report's renewed in 2022 to see if that actually has been the case. But those fundamental human-centric capabilities are still going to remain in our hands. Reasoning and decision-making, communicating and interacting, etc. So that's the sort of real-world application of those sort of technology curves that we've looked at. And then this is quite a useful guide for anyone who's thinking about where they want to upskill and build in capabilities if you're at an inflection point in your career. So you can look at the key skills demands that organizations are looking for in 2018. And a lot of them are very familiar, analytical thinking, complex problem solving, EQ, leadership and social influencing. The ones that are trending towards 2022 are clearly very much focused on those human-centric skills again. So it's about leadership, it's about creativity, it's not just about analysis, it's about storytelling, being able to really bring to life the data. And the things that are declining are broadly what you'd expect. You're starting to see more automation of global processes, obviously more automation of sort of manual inputs. And it really does speak to where the world of work is going to go, but it's very much an evolution more than a revolution. And I think the response of businesses is equally encouraging. You know, I see this as a really optimistic picture. So automation is at the top of the agenda. There's absolutely no doubt about that. It's going to be a significant factor in organization strategies, in people strategies. But I think this really shows that the future of work is going to be about employees really investing in people fundamentally. Yes, in technology tools that will allow automation, but two of the top three things here are direct people investments. So this is investing in hiring new staff with those new relevant skills to really operate the new technological landscape. But it's also about retaining existing employees and retraining them. And I think it's a very, very reassuring and optimistic picture. And it's quite the opposite of what is often portrayed in the press, in all honesty. You know, I think there's a lot of scaremongering about loss of jobs, and there's no doubt that is going to be the case. You know, every sort of leap forwards in terms of technology and work is what used to be called creative destruction. But I think it's going to be far less of a steep curve than people think. And I think it's really going to you know, allow individuals to develop their careers into areas that are fundamentally more rewarding. And I think the other piece that I'd add here is we're really starting to see the pickup of the gig economy. So the gig economy is quite emotive and quite controversial. I think it's been it's been thought of as really aligned to things like 0 hours contracts and exploitative working conditions. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. But the gig economy that's emerging now is around really high tariff skill sets. So things like data science and analytics, creative design, user experience, user interface. And what's just starting to come through now are sort of new platforms that almost work like dating apps. So they match up freelancers with opportunities, and this is subtly but distinctly different from traditional from traditional temporary working. You know, in the UK, I'm sure a lot of people on this call have worked on day rate contracts, but most of the time those are still 5 days a week with one organisation in the office, and not that different from permanent workers. The change that we'll start to see through this decade is more people taking on, you know, incremental work. So working 20% of their time for one company, 20% for another, 20% for a third, but doing it as individuals. And the technology that underpins this, and it will be blockchain largely that does, will allow that to become possible. And for people who are, you know, in the right spaces, you know, will have a huge degree of control over their career to a completely different extent to what we've been used to in the past. And just very briefly, this might be a bit difficult to read if you're on a small screen, but I'll send the slides out afterwards. There's quite a nice analysis on the UK specifically, because this is very much a global report, as you'd expect from the WEC. And it really does go through some of the key factors that are driving things like job location decisions. It'd be interesting to see these after COVID as well as before. But interestingly, talent availability is right at the top of the tree for pretty much every sector. There's some interesting, some really, quite contradictory stuff in the emerging job roles, because you've got some stuff here that really is about technology and implementation of technology. But again, you've got some things here that are still relatively, you could almost call it last generation, you know, assembly and factory workers. But a lot of it is also about, you know, those human factor jobs. You know, how are you going to not just get that technology implemented, communicate it across your own business, communicate it to your customers. And I think that's, again, mirrored in the sort of technology adoption across the UK, similar to across the rest of the world. And then it's worth looking at different industries if you're feeling opportunistic and open a bit of a career shift. So this is from a report by Workday. So Workday, probably the largest sort of people solutions system and technology stack globally. So they have an annual, what they call organizational agility report, huge amounts of information in there. But this refers to what they call digital leaders and digital laggards. And it is quite interesting because some of the industries that you might expect to be at the front aren't, and vice versa. So media, you'd kind of expect to be at the front of the maturity curve, given the disruption of traditional prints. Higher education was an interesting one for me. So there's a lot of laggards, but there's a lot of early adopters. And I think COVID will only have accelerated that as things like online degrees become much more prevalent. Hospitality, governments have adopted very early in some areas. The one that's maybe slightly surprising is retail. You think that they'd be at the front of the queue, but actually, if you look at a lot of traditional retail, bricks and mortar was in a lot of trouble before the pandemic. So maybe that's reflective of that, but definitely worth a look through to think about different industries. So I'll just finish with some final thoughts here. So fundamentally, every technological leap forward has created more jobs than it's removed. COVID has only accelerated what was already in flight. Change is BAU, and it's accelerating exponentially. We're 1% into the digital age by any number of futurologists' publications. Profitability, sustainability, and ethical business models are interdependent and not mutually exclusive. And I think that's a change that is really being brought through now when looking at investor reports and that sort of thing. Having clarity on the differences between optimization, innovation, and invention is really critical for individuals. And working out where you want to play within that is really critical, and maybe we can talk to that in the Q&A session. Understanding how to overcome barriers to agility is a commodifiable skill set. I see this from a big company point of view, but I think it's relevant everywhere. Being able to help with those equations on fast decision making, fail fast mentality, as the speed of new technological disruption increases, is a really true viable skill set. This is a personal prediction. I think low-code solutions will lower barriers to entry. So what I mean by that is, I'm not convinced that everyone's going to have to learn to code. That was something that was, prevalent a few years ago. It's still, broadly prevalent. I think there's a lot of panic around it. A lot of people are thinking, oh, unless I know how to code, I'm going to be redundant in terms of my ability to work in this environment, in this workplace. I've already started working with low-code apps that can develop products that are very strong from a customer experience point of view. Customers are becoming ever more segmented and demanding. I think there's a generational piece here as well, but people want everything now, and people want it the way that they want it. So customer obsession is absolutely key, regardless of what industry you're in. And creativity and originality are increasingly important capabilities, but only when combined with the ability to analyze, interpret, and compellingly communicate data. I think it's that equation that is really going to sort of denote value in this future technological economy. So that is it for me. Just to note that the opinions are my own and not my employer's, and more than happy to share any of the information that's underpinned this. Just connect with me on LinkedIn and we'll do so.
Thank you.